Thank you very much indeed to Sue and to Dan for inviting me along, and to Brendan for what he said at the beginning. I remember my first ever Unions21 seminar was in the seminar we had straight after the 2001 election victory, when we were just going into what turned out to be a difficult phase within the Labour movement about public service reform. But compared to the challenges we face now, they were in retrospect easier times, and I've always been a supporter of Unions21 because you've always led these debates and combined the sort of leading the debate about policy and ideas and research, as we see today in the presentation you're going to have later on about the attitudes of young people to trade unions, but at the same time also a very strong campaigning drive as well. And it's that sort of partnership and combination of policy and campaigning which I think is what makes a good opposition, a good Labour movement in these times. So very good to be here with Unions21. And I'd like to start by, I was in Selly last night. We've been doing a lot of outreach, public meetings around the country as the official opposition, paid for by the short money. I've done about 12 or 13 of them now, right across the UK. I did 2 yesterday, one in Telford, 50 people, a second one in Selly Oak, about 150 people. These are not Labour Party members or trade union members necessarily, Liberal Democrats, Tories, non-voters, the non-aligned, but people who wanted to come along to a school at our invitation to have an hour and a half discussion about what was worrying them. And it is very interesting and important to understand, I think, the mood you get from these meetings. People don't want opposition for opposition's sake. They don't want us to deny the scale of the challenges, the difficulty of the task. They don't want us to show no sense of responsibility. They don't think that you can deny the challenge. But at the same time, we did a short straw poll in this 150 meeting, amongst 150 people. There was 3 people who thought we should deny that the deficit was a problem, and there were 10 people who thought that it was right to try and eliminate the deficit in 10 years, and the other 130 were pretty clear that at the moment things were too deep and too fast and destabilising. They wanted Labour to set out the alternative, but they thought we should do so more loudly and more clearly than they had heard over the last 9 months. And that throws down a real challenge to us as a Labour Party and a Labour movement. I think next Saturday is very important. I think Brendan Barber and the TUC have led this campaign over the last 9 months with great skill and great wisdom, but there is no doubt this is a difficult task and requires us to be very careful and sophisticated at understanding the nature of the political challenge we face as a Labour Party, as a Labour movement, as a trade union movement as well. And I'm going to come back to saying something like that at the very end, the nature of the challenge and the kind of leadership that we are going to need to show ourselves from Brendan and colleagues, but also from the Labour opposition. The context of this, as Brendan just described, and the challenges we now face, the interesting thing about the public is that while they, I think, too much are currently inclined to believe the propaganda of the last 9 months, that this was a crisis caused by excessive public spending, too much borrowing by a Labour government. People really want to know what's happening now and what you're going to do and how will that make things better for me, my family, my community for the future. And also, when you get into a discussion, people also know the reason why Lehman's Bank collapsed in New York wasn't because there was too much public spending on the NHS here in Britain. The reason why there was a subprime mortgage lending disaster across southern American states wasn't because we were borrowing to invest here in Britain. It wasn't the case that there were financial market failures in Japan and Germany and France, as well as in Britain and America. That wasn't caused by excessive regulation in Britain to deliver maternity leave and paternity leave for parents. People know this was actually a global financial crisis, and they want us to say, of course we didn't spend every pound right, but actually people supported the extra money for the NHS, the rise in national insurance tax, the investment in education. People were shocked to see the cancellation of school buildings last summer when that was announced. But they were told for a long time after the election there was no alternative, there was no choice, this was the only way to do things, that the financial markets were forcing this upon us, that there was only one way to do this, to accelerate deficit reduction, to cut public spending fast, to get rid of the whole deficit in one parliament. And they were also told that it was going to work. David Cameron said in October, the economy is now out of the danger zone, he told Parliament. George Osborne said at the beginning of December, judge me on the figures. He said, there's no sign of cuts in public spending. We haven't even really begun. There's no sign of that impacting upon growth in the economy. Judge me on the figures. And the reason why people are now worried is because people aren't judging the government on the figures, and they're getting quite worried. We've just seen unemployment reach a 17-year high. The West Midlands, where I was yesterday, the biggest rise in unemployment of any region in the country. Youth unemployment now just below 1 million, above 20% and rising. An economy which a year ago, when Labour was in government, coming out of that big global recession, was growing, had unemployment falling, had inflation low, is now 12 months on, and following that radical shift in economic policy from George Osborne and the June Osborne, in the June budget, is an economy which has got unemployment rising, inflation rising too, and where the economy didn't grow at the end of last year, actually contracted. So things have gone into reverse. They've gone into reverse in a way which is starting to affect people in a very direct way. And at the moment, I mean, the fact is that redundancy notices are going out in local government around the country, but the public spending cuts haven't really begun. The fiscal contraction, as economists call it, the crushing of the economy by cancelling contracts, cutting spending, laying off public and private sector workers, a contraction bigger than anything we've seen in Britain in the last 70 years, bigger than anything post-war, bigger than any country in the world other than Greece. It hasn't begun. It doesn't actually really start to affect the economy directly until after April, but people know it's happening and they know it's coming. And people are rational, they anticipate the future. And so we've already seen the biggest fall in consumer and business confidence for 20 years. And when confidence is falling, and when people are saying, as they are increasingly since the autumn, actually, we now think that the economy is going in the wrong direction, the government's leading us the wrong way, this is too severe, that is not an environment in which businesses are saying, well, let's create jobs, let's invest in the future, let's try out new ideas. The whole premise of the economic strategy of the coalition is that you can cut 1 million jobs, half in the public, half in the private sector, through public spending cuts, but that will be okay, because the private sector is going to create more jobs than that spontaneously, separate from any impact of the public sector. This is the most heroic economic experiment I've ever seen, but it's an experiment with people's lives and jobs and services. And as somebody who thinks about these things sometimes as an economist, I would say, well, a fiscal contraction on this scale, the multiplier effect onto the economy, the way it will impact on jobs and then on confidence and public services, it's too deep, it's too fast, and that's why I'm worried. I don't think most people in the public would quite talk about it that way. They would say, they're going to put up tuition fees to £9,000 a year next year. That's just too fast. They're going too far. They'll say they're actually going to close children's centres and they can do it immediately. They're going to lay off this many public service workers. They're going to spend £1 billion on a massive NHS reorganisation, which even the doctors aren't prepared for. It's just too fast what they're doing. They're going too far. It's too deep and too fast. And I think that the economic argument we're making about the overall economy is actually increasingly reflecting the way in which people see the reality of those policy choices and those economic choices in their own lives, in their own communities, youth unemployment rising, people being made redundant, young people thinking, well, halfway through my course, they're going to take away my email. That's just going too far, it's too fast, and there's got to be a better way. And our responsibility is to set out that clearer and fairer way, and that's what our budget challenge to George Osborne is. The biggest difference is that we think that what he's doing is going radically too fast in getting the deficit down. And not understanding that there's three things which will get the deficit down. First of all, some difficult public spending choices, which we've always been clear, as has the TUC and others, that there will be some difficult decisions we have to make. Secondly, tax rises. We set out our tax choices. We wouldn't have raised VAT in January, an open goal if I've seen one, but there were tax rises, including the top rate of tax, national insurance rises. But the third way, and by far the most important way in which we'll get this deficit down, is to have an economy which grows with more people in work paying taxes as their incomes rise. If instead you have an economy where nobody's wages are rising, unemployment's going up because the economy's not growing, you've got fewer people in work paying tax, that makes it harder to get the deficit down, not easier. And George Osborne was pretty confident in the autumn that he was going to be able to see the economy growing strongly this year. By the autumn, the Office of Budget Responsibility had already downgraded the forecast for growth for this year. I think it is heroic for George Osborne to think that he's going to be able to maintain those growth rates this year. And that's on the evidence of what's happened before the fiscal contraction has even begun. So I think Brendan's right to say, at best we're in for a difficult period this year and next in terms of jobs, growth and the deficit. And the interesting parallel is the 1930s, which I won't labour in detail because I talked about it in that Bloomberg speech, but it's very important to remember in the 1930s, when Ramsay MacDonald left the Labour Party and became the Prime Minister of a coalition government to drive through spending cuts to get the deficit down in the face of Labour and Liberal opposition after the financial market crash of 1929, that national coalition government to cut spending and unemployment support didn't just deliver the Great Depression and rising unemployment, it also saw the deficits and the debt get worse, not better. And as Brendan said, you either learn the lessons of history or you repeat the mistakes of history, and I think we're seeing the repeating of the mistakes of history here on a grand scale. It's also impacting very directly, not just on people's services and jobs, but also on living standards, whether that's the price of the fuel people are paying, what's going to happen to people's disposable income. And if you want a good example of how out of touch I think the coalition are, just look at the decision to take child benefit away from families on the top rate of tax and understand what David Cameron means when he says we can afford to do this because these families are rich, are well off, they don't need the support. If you are a family with one earner on £45,000, just over the threshold, you're on an above average income. You are considerably above the average family income. So you are better off than the average. Let's say that you've got 3 kids and a partner who doesn't work. What is going to happen as a result of the child benefit cut, the removing of that universal pillar of the welfare state, is that family on £45,000, after tax probably about £30,000, after the housing costs probably about half that, they will lose close to £3,000. It's probably a quarter of all their disposable income before they pay for anything after housing costs. To do something so drastic, so hard-hitting, even to a family on higher than average incomes, that is really tough. And David Cameron says, well, it's fine because they're well off. And those families will say, well, look, I accept that we've got to make our contribution to getting the deficit down, but it's too far and too fast, and we can't deal with that. And I think many people will be saying this across lower and middle income families. That's why we talk about the squeeze middle. The third thing that Brendan said will be a budget challenge, which I think is also right, is these longer term questions. There's no doubt that we need to reform our financial services industry to make sure it better serves the needs of our economy, as well as operating in a transparent and proper way. There's no doubt that what's happened in the financial crisis has accelerated the competitive challenge for us from countries around the world and in emerging markets. And there's no doubt there's big lessons for us to learn and think about in terms of how you really support a balanced economy, a high-skill economy, how you get employers to train. And I don't think at this stage we've got the answer to every one of those questions. But you can't provide the answers unless you understand the question and the challenge. And when you actually listen to what the coalition is saying currently about the challenge for growth, the main centrepiece of their pre-budget strategy is being announced today, which is to remove the right to flexible working for mothers and fathers, for small businesses employing 10 people or less. The idea that the reason why our economy is not growing is not because of the fiscal contraction or the failure of the financial services industry, but because there were excessive rights for mums and dads. And the idea that that is a growth strategy is another example of a government which just isn't in the real world. And deregulation and planning, outsourcing of public services, and taking away the rights to paternity leave for parents. That is not a growth strategy. It's actually, if anything, a return to an early 1980s view that if only Britain was the Hong Kong of Europe with less tax and less regulation, somehow we could succeed in the competitive challenges of the future. I'm afraid that's what the Irish economy tried in the middle part of this decade, when George Osborne said, look to Ireland and see the lessons we must learn. But he hasn't said that recently, to be honest with you. There is, though, and let me end here because I want to get to some questions. There is, though, a big political challenge in all of this, and how we respond. And there has been actually great leadership and foresight already across the union movement and the local government world in the way in which they've responded to these challenges. I went up to the Northwest during the leadership election and remember meeting a group of Unison members with Frank Holmes, the regional secretary, and one of them saying, it's all very well coming along, you leadership candidates, with your visions for the future and your analysis of the past, but our members are losing their jobs now, and what are you doing about it? And the answer was, well, we weren't in government and we weren't doing anything about it, but which is a huge burden for all of us. But the question was, what challenge were we laying down? And in the last few months, often outside the headlines, that is the challenge which is being faced up to local government across the country. And it's very interesting. I went back to Liverpool a week ago to see where they've got to. Talk to trade unions, talk to the Labour Council. A Labour Council which David Cameron accused a month ago in Prime Minister's questions of using politically motivated public spending cuts in Liverpool. It's Labour local government which is politically motivated in these spending cuts. Well, a shocking accusation. But the interesting thing was, in dialogue with the trade unions, the Labour leadership in Liverpool tried to negotiate a fair way to approach this, as far as they could, with the Liberal Democrats, the Liberals, the Greens, the Independents, got to the final budget meeting, almost certainly, I would say, because of a call from Downing Street, the Liberal Democrats at the last minute walked out. They came back an hour later with an alternative budget proposal, which was then declared illegal by the Chief Executive. The irony of the Liberal Democrats proposing an illegal budget in Liverpool, but Labour with the trade unions responsibly saying, no, that's not a game we're going to play, we're not going to fall for David Cameron's trap after the events of the 1980s in that city. What a change. But there's no doubt everybody's also really worried about how they'll deal with this and what will happen next year. But I think we need to be very alive to David Cameron's political strategy. When he says Liverpool's politically motivated, when he said a year ago in the BA Unite strike, bring it on, what David Cameron wants is for the failure of the economy this year, for the slowing of the economy, for the challenge of unemployment, to be overshadowed or seen in the context of a kind of bitter fight between the government and the trade union movement. He wants to be saying, bring it on, and for us to respond in kind, to play that kind of 1980s politics. I have to say, not only does the public not want to go back to the 1980s, and we lost seven times more days in strikes than under the Labour government the last 13 years, I don't think the trade union movement does either. What David Cameron would like nothing better than is to say that the reason why we're in trouble is because of the irresponsibility of Labour and the trade union movement, and therefore it's only by tough leadership and deregulation that we can finally get this economy growing and moving again. It would be a travesty because it's such a flawed argument. But it's very important we understand that. What does that mean? If I was to say, well, the conclusion of that to the people in Selly Oak last night is, I'm really sorry, but we're so responsible, we're just going to implement these cuts, the public would go mad and say, what are you doing? You've got to stand up for us. You've got to stand up with us. We've got to set out the alternative. What it means, though, is we must not play David Cameron at his game. We've got to be the people who don't just win the fight on the streets, but the argument in the newspapers and in towns and pubs and clubs up and down the country. We have to be the people who are setting out the fairer alternative, and we have to march, and we have to demonstrate, and we have to stand up with people, not simply for ourselves. David Cameron, and the research says this very clearly, would love this to be a sectional fight for the Tory government and the trade union movement. The reason why we'll succeed is because actually, and this comes back to where I started, Brendan's leadership in the last 5 months, I think the trade union movement is leading with the public, with nurses and doctors and teachers, and public service workers and private sector workers who've lost contracts, and parents and the elderly who need care, leading a uprising in communities saying, this isn't fair, it's not right, it's too far and too fast. And what we'll see next Saturday won't be an expression simply of organised labour. It will be a whole community across the UK speaking up against what David Cameron and George Osborne has done. And that's happening, I think, because of the responsible but very determined way in which this campaign has been led by the TUC and by the trade union movement over the last 9 months. And we have to keep it that way. The partnership we have for the next few months and years is very important in this. We have to do this with vigour, but also with responsibility. We have to expose the fact that these days in British politics, it's David Cameron, George Osborne and Nick Clegg who are the true extremists. And if we can expose their extremism and show that we are the people who are standing up for the public interest, the national interest in opposing these public spending cuts, then I think it's an argument we can win.